He was born enslaved, in a world where freedom was a fantasy. The name was Jean-Jacques Dessalines, a man who would one day carve his name into the very foundations of a new nation, Haiti. But before he wore a crown, before he was called emperor, he was just another cog in the brutal machine of colonial Saint-Domingue. No one could have guessed that this man, beaten, broken, and bound, would rise to lead the greatest slave uprising the world had ever seen. A rebellion so fierce it didn't just shake a colony, it shattered an empire. At first, he fought as part of the French army, resisting British and Spanish threats to the colony, but the winds of loyalty shift when promises are broken. And when the French betrayed his commander, Toussaint Louverture, kidnapped him and sent him to die in a frozen French prison, Dessalines knew. This was no longer a fight for survival. It was a fight for independence. On May 18, 1803, he took command of the indigenous army, l'Armée Indigène. Under his leadership, the soldiers who had once been enslaved crushed the mighty French forces at the Battle of Vertières. Just months later, on January 1, 1804, a new nation was born from the ashes of oppression, Haiti. The first Black Republic. The first country in the Western Hemisphere to permanently abolish slavery. And standing at its helm, Jean-Jacques Dessalines. The generals crowned him Emperor Jacques I, ruler of a free people. But liberation came with a cost. To secure Haiti's future, he ordered the expulsion, and in many cases, the elimination, of the French still on the island. It was brutal, controversial, but in his eyes necessary. This was not just politics. This was vengeance for generations. Dessalines wasn't perfect. He ruled fiercely, with a will forged in blood and fire. But his legacy is undeniable. Alongside Louverture, he became one of Haiti's founding fathers, a symbol of Black resilience, and a man who dared to declare, "We will never be slaves again." And for that, history remembers. But the victory was not the end. It was the beginning of something far more complicated. In 1804, Emperor Dessalines made a chilling decree: the French who remained in Haiti, the same class that once owned and brutalized the African-born population, would face judgment. What followed was a dark chapter, the massacre of 3,000 to 5,000 French settlers. The world watched in horror, but to Dessalines, it was a brutal necessity. Whispers of a French reinvasion loomed. The fear wasn't paranoia, it was history repeating itself. Just years earlier, Napoleon had promised peace, then kidnapped Louverture and reinstated slavery elsewhere in the Caribbean. Dessalines refused to give the French another opportunity. But not all Europeans faced the blade. Polish soldiers who had switched sides during the Revolution, who had seen the humanity in Haiti's struggle, were spared. So too were the Germans, who had never trafficked in the slave trade. Dessalines didn't just spare them, he made them citizens. In his eyes, anyone who stood with freedom, who rejected the brutality of slavery, was family. He called them Black, not by color, but by allegiance. Still, tension simmered, especially with the mixed-race elite, those who had once thrived under colonial rule. They were educated, property-owning, and saw themselves as separate from the Black majority. Dessalines saw division, and he knew true independence required unity. But unity, it turned out, was not so easily commanded. As emperor, Dessalines tried to revive the economy by enforcing labor on the plantations, land that had once been soaked with the blood of slaves. Though no longer enslaved, the people were now subjects under an autocrat. The freedom they'd fought for came with the weight of a crown. Then, in 1806, betrayal came not from France, but from within. Members of Dessalines' own administration turned against him. The very men who once followed him into battle now conspired behind closed doors. They struck him down, and a furious mob did the rest. His body, dismembered, left as a message. The emperor was dead, but his legacy refused to die. A century later, the nation he helped forge looked back with new eyes. They saw not just a warrior or a ruler, but the symbol of something deeper: resistance, identity, freedom. In 1903, on the eve of Haiti's centennial of independence, the national anthem was written. Its title, La Dessalinienne, because even in death, Dessalines remained what he had always been. Not just a man, but a movement. A declaration that no one, no empire, would ever break Haiti again. Before the battle cries, before the empire, there was a boy, born into chains, nameless in the eyes of history, on a plantation called Cormier, near Grande Rivière du Nord. His name, then? Jean-Jacques Duclos, a name not chosen, but inherited from his enslaver, Henri Duclos. His parents, their African roots, their stories, lost to time, swallowed by the vast shadow of the slave trade Saint-Domingue, the pearl of the French colonies, was drenched in sugar and soaked in blood. Here, under the blistering Caribbean sun, Jean-Jacques labored in the sugarcane fields, day after day, year after year. He endured, and in the hierarchy of suffering, he rose, to commandeur, a foreman of the enslaved. It was power, but only within a cage. At around 30, a twist of fate changed the course of his life. He was purchased by a free man of color, an affranchi, whose surname was Dessalines. This man wasn't just his new master. He gave Jean-Jacques something far more powerful than freedom. He gave him his name. From that day on, he was no longer Jean-Jacques Duclos. He was Jean-Jacques Dessalines. He worked under this new master for a few more years. But the fire inside him, stoked by decades of humiliation, pain, and quiet rage, was already burning. When freedom finally came, Jean-Jacques didn't just keep the name Dessalines. He made it feared, revered, eternal. From the fields of Cormier to the heights of revolution, the story of Jean-Jacques Dessalines was only just beginning. In 1791, the fire finally lit. The enslaved people of Saint-Domingue, beaten, starved, and stripped of everything but their will to survive, rose up. The uprising spread like wildfire across the Plaine du Nord, the heartland of sugarcane plantations. It was here that so many had died, and where even more continued to arrive from Africa, packed onto slave ships like cargo to replace the fallen among the rebels, was a man whose soul had been forged in those very fields, Jean-Jacques Dessalines. But behind his fierce resolve stood an unlikely figure, a woman. Her name was Victoria Montu, or perhaps Akbaraya Toya. History remembers both names, but what it never forgets is her influence. She was his mentor, his first commander. She taught him how to fight, not just with weapons, but with purpose. She turned his pain into power. As the revolution raged, so did Dessalines' fury. Not only at the white colonists who had enslaved him, but also at the gens de couleur libre, the mixed-race elite. They had lived above the enslaved, owned land, and in many cases owned slaves themselves. And when war broke out, many of them sided with the colonists. To Dessalines, it was betrayal. And in betrayal, he found clarity. The revolution wasn't just a rebellion. It was a war for identity, for dignity, for ownership of the very land watered by the blood of the enslaved. It was a war not only against the French, but against any force, white or brown, that stood in the way of freedom. French, British, Spanish, they all came. They all fought to crush the uprising. Each empire desperate to maintain control over their Caribbean jewels, their sugar empires, their enslaved labor. But what they didn't understand was that they weren't just fighting an army. They were fighting a reckoning. And standing in the center of that storm, wielding his pain like a sword, was Jean-Jacques Dessalines. The war had ended, but the wounds were still raw. The French were gone, expelled, defeated, humiliated. Haiti stood alone, the first free black republic, born from blood and fire. But Jean-Jacques Dessalines knew that victory was fragile. So in 1804, he made a decision that would echo across history, a final purge. He ordered the execution of the remaining Europeans on Haitian soil. They were overwhelmingly French, men, women, children. It didn't matter if they had shown kindness. It didn't matter if they had been neutral to Dessalines. They were part of the system that had brutalized generations. Even many free people of color, those who had once held privilege under colonial rule, met the same fate. It was merciless. It was total. And it was, in his eyes, necessary. This was more than revenge. It was an act of defiance, a declaration to the world. Haiti would never again be a colony. No chain would ever touch their soil. No invader would be spared. And yet, in a twist that confounded even his closest allies, Dessalines extended mercy to one man, his former master. The man who had once owned him, who had decided his fate. Jean-Jacques Dessalines brought that man into his own home, gave him shelter, gave him work. Why? Was it forgiveness? Was it power? Perhaps it was to show that he no longer belonged to anyone, that the roles had reversed, that the enslaved had become the emperor? Or maybe it was a lesson that justice and vengeance did not always walk hand in hand. Whatever the reason, it revealed a paradox at the heart of Dessalines. Ruthless in war, unpredictable in peace. A man capable of unimaginable fury and moments of unexpected grace. Behind the legend, behind the steel of the soldier and the shadow of the emperor, there was a man. And like all men, Jean-Jacques Dessalines had a family, a life beyond the battlefield. He married a woman named Marie-Claire Heureuse Félicité Bonheur, from the city of Léogane. She was grace where he was fury, compassion where he was storm. Their wedding was no small affair. It was held in the Grand Saint-Marc Church, and standing witness to their union was none other than Toussaint Louverture himself. When Dessalines crowned himself emperor under the 1805 Constitution, Marie-Claire became Empress of Haiti. And from her hands came something small, yet enduring soup joumou, the famous pumpkin soup, once forbidden to slaves, now a symbol of freedom. A meal once served only to masters, now savored by every Haitian on Independence Day. They say she created it. Whether true or not, the soup became a ritual, a celebration of a nation that refused to kneel. Marie-Claire lived a full century. She outlived her husband by decades, revered as the adopted wife of the nation, a title gifted to her by President Alexandre Pétion after Dessalines was assassinated. She bore, or adopted, 16 children, including those from Dessalines' earlier relationships. Among them, a son named Innocent, whose name now adorns a fort in his honor. In a move both political and personal, Dessalines once offered one of his daughters to Pétion, the leading voice of the gens de couleur. Hoping to bridge Haiti's painful racial divide, Pétion declined, saying she was already in love with Chancy, the nephew of Toussaint Louverture. Whether true or not, the offer and the refusal revealed just how fragile unity in Haiti still was beyond the palace halls. There was another woman, Euphémie d'Aguille. Not a queen, but remembered all the same. She was his confidant, his lover, and the creator of the Caribbean, a dance he adored. That rhythm, born of love and rebellion, still echoes through Haitian homes today, danced in celebration, danced in memory. Dessalines was not alone in his rise. He had two brothers, Louis and Joseph Duclos. Like him, they shed the name of their enslaver and took on Dessalines. Their sons would grow into men of power, taking seats within Haiti's new government, helping shape the young republic their uncle had died to build. Because though the man is gone, his legacy lives. Through names, through dances, through soup served warm every January, through family, through history, through Haiti. It began with fire. In 1791, the enslaved of the northern plains rose as one, a tidal wave of fury and hope. Jean-Jacques Dessalines was among them, shoulder to shoulder with thousands who refused to die on their knees. Their leaders were men like Jean-François Papillon and Georges Biassou. Their mission? Burn the plantations, break the chains, begin the revolution. This was no simple rebellion. It was the spark of what would become the first and only successful slave uprising in the Western Hemisphere. It was the beginning of Haiti. At first, Dessalines joined forces with Spain, fighting against the French colonialists. He followed Papillon into Santo Domingo, the eastern half of the island, and enlisted in the Spanish military. And it was there, amid strategy and smoke, that he met a man who would change his life and the world, Toussaint Breda. History would come to know him as Toussaint Louverture. Like Dessalines, Toussaint had been born into bondage, but his mind was sharp, his spirit indomitable. At the time, both men were fighting alongside the Spanish, but the world was shifting. In 1794, revolutionary France, desperate to save itself, made a declaration. Slavery would be abolished in its colonies. It was a promise, and for once, it was one worth fighting for. Toussaint switched allegiances, turning his sword against the Spanish and the British, who had invaded to claim Saint-Domingue for themselves. Dessalines followed him, no longer fighting for empire, but for liberty, for a new world. As the revolution deepened, so did Dessalines' role. He became Louverture's chief lieutenant, trusted, brutal, loyal. By 1799, he had risen to the rank of brigadier general, no longer a slave, no longer a name on someone else's ledger. Now, he was a leader, a warrior, a man carving freedom into the very bones of the land. Because for Dessalines, and for those who bled beside him, freedom wasn't a gift, it wasn't granted, it was seized, it was earned, and it would never, ever be surrendered again. By the dawn of the 19th century, Jean-Jacques Dessalines was no longer just a general, he was a force, a whirlwind of precision, fury, and resolve. City after city fell beneath his command, Jacmel, Petit-Goâve, Miragoâne, Ancestry. Where his troops marched, resistance crumbled, and when rebellion stirred within their own ranks, Dessalines did not flinch. In 1801, when General Moise, Toussaint Louverture's own nephew, led a revolt in the north, Dessalines crushed it with brutal speed. No trial, no forgiveness. Just swift, merciless retribution. It cemented his reputation. He was a man who took no prisoners. A man who would rather burn a village to ashes than let it fall into the wrong hands. To some, he was a savior. To others, a destroyer. But everyone understood one thing. Dessalines did not retreat. And yet, despite the violence, there was progress. Under Louverture's leadership, the rebellion had reclaimed Saint-Domingue, almost entirely. The enslaved had overthrown their masters, and the land was back under French control. On paper. In practice, it was Louverture who ruled. The French made him governor-general, a gesture to keep the illusion of control. But Louverture had other plans. He dreamed not of mere survival, but of sovereignty. He oversaw the creation of a new constitution, one that outlawed slavery, detailed how the colony would govern itself, and above all, declared Saint-Domingue as free. Louverture even named himself governor for life. But still, he swore loyalty to France. To the world, it looked like a man trying to balance a revolution with diplomacy. But to men like Dessalines, it looked like a dangerous compromise. Because while Louverture played the game of politics, Dessalines played for keeps. He had not survived the chains, the battles, and the betrayals just to bend the knee once more. And deep down, he knew. The fight was far from over. But while Saint-Domingue was trying to build a new future, across the Atlantic, a familiar threat was rising. France was no longer a republic in spirit. Now it was under the boot of a single man, Napoleon Bonaparte. The revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality were fading fast, replaced by ambition, empire, and economic desperation. Napoleon's wife, Josephine de Beauharnais, came from a slave-owning family in the Caribbean. Her world, her wealth, built on sugar, built on slaves. And she wasn't alone. White planters and mulatto elites who had once ruled Saint-Domingue were lobbying fiercely in Paris. They wanted their plantations back. They wanted their profits. They wanted slavery. And Napoleon? He listened. The colony had once been the crown jewel of France's overseas empire. Saint-Domingue wasn't just a land. It was a gold mine. Before the uprising, it had generated more wealth than any other French colony. Sugar flowed from its shores, sweetening the coffers of Europe, but without forced labor, that wealth had evaporated. Napoleon didn't see the freedmen of Haiti as citizens. He saw them as a problem to be corrected. And so, he made a decision that would cost him dearly. He resolved to bring slavery back. The people of Saint-Domingue had broken their chains. Now Napoleon was sailing to reforge them. But what he didn't understand, what he could never understand, was that this wasn't just rebellion anymore. This was revolution. This was a people who had tasted freedom. And once you've tasted freedom, you'll burn every empire to the ground before you give it up. In 1802, Napoleon made his move. A massive expeditionary force, ships, soldiers, artillery, descended on Saint-Domingue, led by General Charles Leclerc, Napoleon's brother-in-law. Their mission was clear: crush the revolution, restore French rule, reimpose slavery. But Saint-Domingue would not kneel. Louverture and Dessalines stood side by side once more, not as rebels this time, but as guardians of a nation in the making. And it was Jean-Jacques Dessalines who would etch his legend into history at one of the most iconic battles of the Revolution. Crête-à-Pierrot, March 11th, 1802. A small stone fort, surrounded. Inside, Dessalines commanded just 1,300 men. Former slaves turned soldiers, free men with nothing to lose outside. A French force 18,000 strong. The odds were impossible. The siege relentless. But Dessalines did not waver. At the onset of battle, he stood before his men with a torch in one hand and a powder keg behind him. Flame licked the air, and with defiance in his voice, he declared, if the French breached the walls, he would ignite the powder, blow them all to glory rather than surrender. This wasn't just a fight for land. It was a fight for memory, for justice, for the blood of their ancestors, and they fought like men possessed. The French paid dearly. Their casualties were staggering. For 20 grueling days, Dessalines and his warriors held out, starving, exhausted, but unbroken. When supplies finally ran out, they made one final move. They didn't surrender. They stormed through the French lines, guns blazing, bodies bloodied, and vanished into the Cahos Mountains. They escaped, not as fugitives, but as legends. Their army was still intact, their spirit untouched. The message was clear. The revolution would not be buried. Not by soldiers, not by empires, not even by Napoleon himself. But the battlefield was not divided only by color. In the war for Haiti's soul, the lines ran deeper, through class, allegiance, and betrayal. When General Leclerc arrived with his French forces, he didn't come alone. Marching beside him were familiar faces: Alexandre Pétion and André Rigaud. Both were sons of white plantation owners. Both were gens de couleur, free men of mixed race. Both had once walked the same soil, breathed the same air, and now raised arms against the same revolution they had claimed to support. Years earlier, Pétion and Rigaud had led their own bid for power, trying to carve out an independent stronghold in the south of Saint-Domingue. It was a region where the gens de couleur owned land, wielded influence, and, in many cases, slaves. But Louverture crushed that dream. His forces routed them. They fled in defeat. Now they returned, this time under the banner of France. To Dessalines and the black generals of the revolution, this wasn't just opposition. It was treason. A betrayal not just of Haiti, but of history. These were men who had tasted privilege under colonial rule, who had seen freedom not as a universal right, but as a personal inheritance, and now they stood with the very empire that sought to bring slavery back. The revolution had once held the promise of unity, but in the face of power, old wounds reopened. The divisions between black and mulatto, enslaved and free-born, once again threatened to tear the island apart. Yet amidst that chaos, Dessalines stood unwavering. He had no patience for half measures or divided loyalties. To him, the path was clear. You were either with the people or you were with the chains. And then, in a moment that would stain his legacy forever, Dessalines turned. After the heroic stand at Crête-à-Pierrot, after years of fighting side by side with Toussaint Louverture, Dessalines did the unthinkable. He defected. He aligned himself with the very forces they had been resisting: General Leclerc, Alexandre Pétion, and André Rigaud. Why? Some say it was strategy, others ambition. But one thing is certain: his betrayal played a part in what came next. On May 22nd, 1802, Dessalines penned a letter. He had learned that Louverture had failed to enforce a ceasefire with a local rebel leader. In that letter, Dessalines denounced Louverture's actions as extraordinary. A quiet but lethal accusation. It gave the French the excuse they needed. Just weeks later, Jean-Baptiste Brunet, under the pretense of negotiation, arrested Louverture, and over 100 members of his inner circle, Dessalines and his wife, were rewarded with gifts, a gesture of gratitude or of guilt. On June 7th, 1802, Louverture was taken aboard a ship bound not for diplomacy, but for exile. He was locked away in the cold stone walls of Fort de Joux, deep in the mountains of France. There, cut off from his people, stripped of power, Toussaint Louverture died, April 7th, 1803. 60 years of life, centuries of impact. Before he left, Louverture gave a warning. In overthrowing me, you have only cut down the trunk of the tree of liberty. It will spring back from the roots, for they are numerous and deep. He was right. But for Dessalines, the cost of that betrayal would follow him like a shadow. Even his own son, Isaac, believed he had a hand in it. The revolution had lost its father, and the weight of what came next would rest entirely on the shoulders of the man who survived. But the truth has a way of rising, no matter how deep you try to bury it. By late 1802, the mask had fully slipped. Word spread that in Guadeloupe, another French colony, Napoleon had done the unthinkable. Slavery had been reinstated. Men, women, children who had once been free were shackled again, whipped again, sold again. And suddenly, everything was clear. Dessalines saw the writing on the wall. So did Pétion. The promises, the ceasefires, the gifts, they were all a lie. A stalling tactic. The French hadn't come to negotiate. They had come to re-enslave. So in October 1802, Dessalines switched sides again. But this time, it was different. This time, it was final. He joined forces once more with the revolution. And, with Pétion's blessing, Dessalines rose to the top. Leader of the alliance, commander of the resistance. The soldier who had once betrayed Louverture now carried the full weight of the revolution on his back. And then, fate intervened. General Leclerc, Napoleon's golden hope, fell, not by sword, but by sickness. Yellow fever swept through the French ranks like a silent army. Thousands died, including Leclerc himself. The empire's strength was rotting from within. But it didn't end there. Leclerc's replacement, General Donatien de Rochambeau, arrived with one mission: crush the rebels. His methods were cruel: hangings, drownings, executions. His hatred was blind, his brutality unmatched. And in that cruelty, he achieved the opposite of what he intended. He united the revolutionaries: black, mulatto, affranchi, former slave, freeborn. It no longer mattered. The fight was no longer just a rebellion, it was a war for existence. And leading the charge, standing in the place where Louverture once stood, was Jean-Jacques Dessalines. The tide had turned. The French were weakened, ravaged by disease, exhausted by war, and outmaneuvered by a force they had underestimated from the beginning. And then came the final blow. November 18th, 1803. The Battle of Vertières. It was here, in the shadow of Cap Français, that the final stand was made. Jean-Jacques Dessalines and Alexandre Pétion, once on opposite sides, now fought together as one. Black and mulatto soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, their muskets raised, their minds set. This was the endgame. The French held Fort Vertières under the command of Donatien de Rochambeau, who had ruled with fear. But fear could not withstand fury. The rebels charged. Bullets flew, cannons roared, and from the smoke and blood emerged a truth too powerful to ignore. The enslaved would no longer obey. The colonized would no longer be ruled. The oppressed would no longer kneel. By the next day, Rochambeau surrendered. The mighty French army, Napoleon's army, was finished on December 4th, 1803. They handed over their last hold of territory to the rebels. The war was over. The impossible had become reality. For the first and only time in human history, a slave rebellion had not only succeeded, but had birthed an independent nation, Haiti. It stood as a beacon of freedom in a world still shackled by empire. And the man who led them there, the man who once picked Cain beneath the lash, was now the most successful military commander in Haiti's war against Napoleonic France, Jean-Jacques Dessalines. In 1804, he took the stage not just as a general, but as a nation builder. He issued the Declaration of Independence, a cry carved from centuries of pain and pride. And then he did what no other former slave had ever done. He crowned himself emperor, Jacques I of Haiti. Because this wasn't just a victory, it was a revolution that rewrote history. January 1st, 1804. From the city of Gonaives, a declaration thundered across the Atlantic, a sound that would shake the world. Jean-Jacques Dessalines, standing before his people, proclaimed the former colony free forever. The name Saint-Domingue was cast off like a shackle. In its place, a name reborn from the island's first people, Haiti, the land of the high mountains. The land had once belonged to the Taino, long before colonizers turned it into a plantation graveyard. Now, under Dessalines, it belonged to its people again. He had already been ruling as Governor General since November 30th, 1803. But independence was not enough. Dessalines knew that the new nation needed not just freedom, it needed strength, unity, symbolism. So in September of that same year, his generals, men who had fought beside him through fire and blood, gathered and proclaimed him emperor. On October 6th, in the city of Le Cap, Jean-Jacques Dessalines was crowned Jacques I, Emperor of Haiti. The coronation wasn't just ceremony, it was defiance. A black emperor in a world still ruled by white kings. A man born into slavery, now draped in imperial robes. The crown wasn't just gold, it was justice, it was memory. It was a warning to any who dared dream of reclaiming Haiti. Then, on May 20th, 1805, the empire declared itself in writing the imperial constitution named Dessalines, Emperor for Life. It granted him the power to choose his successor. It codified the revolution into law. Because for Dessalines, the fight had never been just about winning a war. It was about building a future, a nation that would never again bow, never again bleed for another man's sugar. From slave to soldier, from general to emperor, Jean-Jacques Dessalines stood as proof that the arc of history does bend, but only when forced by those brave enough to break it. The empire was born in fire, but peace, as always, proved more elusive than war. In 1805, fresh with the weight of a crown upon his head, Emperor Jean-Jacques Dessalines turned his gaze eastward. The other half of the island, Santo Domingo, remained under French control. To Dessalines, it was unfinished business. He led his forces across the mountains, pushing deep into the eastern territory. But just as swiftly as the invasion began, it stalled. A French naval squadron appeared off the coast, cutting off supply lines, threatening bombardment. Dessalines was bold, but not reckless. He withdrew. Back in the west, the emperor turned his focus to rebuilding the economy. By rebuilding the plantations, he imposed a system of forced labor. No longer slavery in name, but for many of the nouveaux libres, the newly freed majority who had once worked those same fields. It felt hauntingly familiar. Whips may have been replaced with commands, but the rhythm of oppression had returned. The disappointment ran deep. These were the people who had fought, bled, and died to end slavery. And now they were being told to return to the fields for the good of the nation. The anciens libres, those freed before the revolution, mostly mulatto elites, were no more pleased. Dessalines sought to redistribute land to the masses, threatening the wealth and status they had preserved through decades of colonial favor. And within his own military, unease grew. High-ranking officers who had once stood beside him now questioned his rule. Whispers of discontent grew louder. The very unity that had defeated Napoleon's legions was starting to fracture under the weight of Dessalines' iron grip. He had won the war for independence, but ruling a nation, especially one so scarred, so divided, was a different kind of battle. And this time, the enemy was within. With independence came finality. In 1804, when Dessalines declared Haiti a sovereign nation, he didn't just break the chains of empire, he shattered the very foundation of the colonial world. Slavery, he decreed, was abolished. Forever. Haiti became the first nation in the Americas to make the abolition of slavery permanent, not as a temporary gesture or wartime tactic, but as a principle carved into its birth. A nation born from the enslaved would never tolerate enslavement again. But Dessalines knew what they were up against. The sugar plantations, the same ones that had made Saint-Domingue the wealthiest colony in the world, needed labor. Dessalines tried to keep them running without slavery. He needed revenue to rebuild, to defend, to survive. But he had seen too much. He had endured too much. 30 years in bondage. 30 years under the whip, beneath the boots of colonial masters. He had watched the brutality, the cruelty, the slaughter of his people and trust. That had long since died. Most of the white planters, merchants, and even many free people of color had already fled, seeking refuge in Cuba, France, and the United States. But some had remained. Between February and April of 1804, Dessalines made a decision that would define his rule and divide his legacy. He ordered the massacre of the remaining white colonists in Haiti. It became known as the 1804 Haiti Massacre. Men, women, even children were not spared. It was brutal, ruthless, and in Dessalines' mind, necessary. It was a message, not just to the French, but to the world. This land would never again belong to colonizers. In the 1805 Haitian Constitution, Dessalines put it into law. Haiti was a black nation. White colonists were forbidden from owning property or land. And all property previously owned by white colonists? Confiscated to the benefit of the state by incontestable right. This was not revenge. It was revolution made permanent. A declaration that Haiti belonged to its people, not to the ghosts of empire, not to the descendants of slave traders, but to those who had fought and died and risen so that no child would ever be born in chains again. Freedom had been won, but building a nation would cost more than blood. As emperor, Jean-Jacques Dessalines faced an impossible task: revive an economy built on slavery, without slavery. And so, he turned to discipline, to control, to the only model he had ever known. He enforced what historian Michel Rolfe Trouillot would later call caporalisme agraire, agrarian militarism. The logic was simple but severe. Every black Haitian would either defend the nation with arms or sustain it through labor. Plantations weren't abolished, they were reorganized. Workers were no longer slaves, but they were still bound to the land, compelled to produce sugar, coffee, and other exports vital to Haiti's survival. Orders were strict. Enforcement, harsher still. Some who had once fought for liberty now whispered bitterly that it felt like bondage by another name. Dessalines believed it was a sacrifice for sovereignty. The young republic needed trade. It needed revenue. But it needed caution. Most of all, France could never be trusted again. And so Dessalines looked elsewhere, encouraging merchants from Britain and the United States, forging ties with powers who had less interest in re-enslavement and more in commerce. But with the revolution's destruction came another challenge: administration. To govern a fractured, traumatized land, Dessalines needed literate, capable officials, men who could manage ports, balance exports, negotiate with foreign traders. And the painful truth? Most of those men came from the gens de couleur, the light-skinned elite who had been educated before the revolution. The very class he once mistrusted became essential to the machinery of his new empire. It was a paradox at the heart of Dessalines' rule. He had shattered the old order, only to rebuild parts of it under a new flag. A nation born from revolution now struggled under the weight of survival, because liberty, hard-won as it was, still came with a cost. Power, no matter how righteously won, is never safe. By 1806, the empire Jean-Jacques Dessalines had built was fracturing from within. Discontent simmered across the country, among the people, among the powerful, the strict labor system, the land redistribution, the iron-fisted rule. His former allies began to turn. Alexandre Pétion, the face of the mulatto elite Henri Christophe, a towering figure of military strength. Together, they joined the whispers of rebellion. In the south, insurrection erupted. In August. By October, it was full-blown. On the 17th of that month, Dessalines rode north from Port-au-Prince, heading toward battle once more. But he would never make it. At a place called Larnage, now Pont Rouge, the emperor met his end. The truth of his death has been twisted by time. Some say he was ambushed on the road, shot at first fire, struck down in a flash of betrayal. Others claim it happened behind closed doors, during a meeting at Pétion's house on Rue L'Enterrement. A trap disguised as diplomacy. One version tells of a man stripped, stabbed, and mutilated. His fingers severed, his body dragged back to Port-au-Prince. Crowds gathered not to mourn, but to desecrate. Stones rained down. The corpse, they said, resembled only scraps, shapeless remains. Another account tells of a final, brutal act. After being shot, his skull was split by a saber, then stabbed 3 times. As his blood soaked the earth he had freed, the mob cried out, "The tyrant is killed." Most reports agree on one thing. His body was dismembered in a public square, torn apart by the very people he had once led to freedom. Dessalines had risen from the chains of slavery to crown himself emperor. He had defeated the world's most powerful army. He had carved a nation out of rebellion. But in the end, he was brought down not by France, nor by foreign enemies, but by his own. Because revolutions do not rest, and the line between liberator and tyrant is sometimes as thin as a blade. Still, the legacy of Jean-Jacques Dessalines lives on, not in monuments, not in palaces, but in a nation that still stands, in a people who still call themselves free, in a history that refuses to forget the man who dared to turn slaves into citizens and chains into crowns. Even in death, Jean-Jacques Dessalines found no peace. After his assassination, resistance stirred not only in politics, but in memory. There were those who refused to bury him, who saw only the tyrant, not the liberator, who turned away from the bloodied man who had once declared an empire free. But one woman did not turn away. Her name was Dédé Basile, a vivandière, a woman who had followed soldiers, nursed the wounded, served in the shadows of war. When others recoiled from his mangled corpse, Dédé gathered the broken remains of the emperor. She carried them. She buried them. In the cimetière intérieur of Church Sainte-Anne, a tomb was raised. It bore a simple inscription: Sigit Dessalines, mort à 48 ans. Here lies Dessalines, died at 48 years old. Years later, his remains were moved, resting now at the Hôtel de la Patrie, the altar of the nation, in the Champ de Mars, side by side with Alexandre Pétion, the very man who may have helped orchestrate his downfall. A monument now stands at the northern edge of Port-au-Prince, marking the place where Dessalines fell. Not just where a man died, but where an era ended. Yet his death did not bring peace. It opened a chasm. Without Dessalines, Haiti fractured. The dream of a united Black Republic dissolved into a civil war. Pétion and Christophe, once brothers in arms, tore the country in two. Pétion took the south, stronghold of the gens de couleur. Christophe seized the north, declaring himself king in a kingdom of former slaves. The revolution had won the war, but it could not escape the ghosts of hierarchy, class, and ambition. Still, one truth remains unshaken. Jean-Jacques Dessalines changed the world. He turned a colony into a country, slaves into citizens, a revolt into a republic. He fell, not as a saint, but as a man who bore the impossible weight of liberation, and in the soil of Haiti, his story endures. Because every January 1st, when Haitians sip the warm soup joumou he made possible, they remember the man who gave them not only freedom, but the audacity to keep it. Though Jean-Jacques Dessalines fell by betrayal, his bloodline marched on. From the ashes of empire and civil war, his family carried forward pieces of the legacy he had carved in stone and fire. His nephew Raymond, son of his brother Louis, rose to power in the kingdom, ruled by Dessalines' old comrade-turned-rival. King Henri Christophe Raymond became Maréchal de Camp and was granted the noble title Baron de Louis Dessalines on April 8, 1811. He served at the side of King Henry I as aide-de-camp, privy councillor, and secretary-general of the Ministry of War. He shaped military policy. He influenced national education as a member of the Royal Chamber of Public Instruction. He was knighted into the Order of St. Henry, a symbol of prestige in Christophe's monarchy. But in 1820, revolution returned, and this time it came for him. Raymond Dessalines was killed at Cap Henri on October 10th, a victim of the same instability that had once claimed his uncle. Another nephew, Joseph, son of Dessalines' brother of the same name, was also elevated to Maréchal de Camp, named Baron de Joseph Dessalines in 1816. He became chamberlain to Prince Jacques-Victor Henry, the heir to Christophe's throne, and major of the Grenadiers de la Garde, Haiti's elite guard. He too was knighted, joining the Order of St. Henry in 1815. Even in monarchy, even in division, the Dessalines name still held weight, still commanded respect, and it would not end there. A grandson, Florville Hippolyte, would one day rise to the highest office in the land. In 1889, he became President of Haiti. He would serve until 1896, governing a nation his grandfather had given everything to create. From revolution to royalty, from empire to republic, the descendants of Jean-Jacques Dessalines continued to walk the halls of power. Because though the emperor fell by sword and betrayal, his legacy refused to die. It lived on, in titles, in presidencies, in the very soil of Haiti, and it whispered, still, the truth the world tried to forget, that once a man born in chains stood up, fought back, and gave birth to the world's first Black Republic. His name was Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and Haiti will never forget him. Time, they say, is the final judge. And by the dawn of the 20th century, the world began to look at Jean-Jacques Dessalines not just as a general, or a ruler, or even a revolutionary, but as something far greater, a symbol, an icon of Haitian nationalism. The nation he forged from chains and ashes began to reclaim his memory. In 1903, Haiti gave him a tribute that would echo through generations, La Dessalinienne, the national anthem, named in his honor. Every time it is sung, it is his story that resounds. In Port-au-Prince, the heart of Haiti's capital, the main artery of the city, once known as Grande Rue, was renamed Boulevard Jean-Jacques Dessalines. It cuts through the capital, like his story cuts through the soul of a nation, running from north to south, lined with commerce, chaos, and life. Across the country, the name endures. Streets, avenues, boulevards, they bear his name. Dessalines. Jean-Jacques. Jacques the Frey. Not just in the capital, but in every corner of Haiti, and even beyond, in lands once tied to Haiti's revolutionary ripples, across what was once Grand Colombia, and in the public squares of Port-au-Prince, of Gonaive, of Cap Haïtien, his statues stand tall. Not to erase his flaws, not to mask the contradictions of his rule, but to honor what he did that no one else dared. To take the enslaved and make them sovereign, to stare down empire and win. Jean-Jacques Dessalines was not perfect. He was human, fiery, flawed, and unrelenting. But in the soil of Haiti, and in the hearts of its people, he remains immortal. Because the story of Haiti cannot be told without him, and as long as freedom is remembered, neither will he. If you found this story as powerful as we did, don't forget to like, share, and drop a comment below. What part of Dessalines' journey moved you the most? And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that history almost forgot. Why stop here? Check out the next video on your screen. It's packed with more untold truths, legendary lives, and moments that shaped our world. Thanks for watching. Your support helps this channel grow and keeps the stories alive.